I am Dr. Nancy Doyle, and I am here today with Judy Singer, the amazing Judy Singer, Dame Judy, as I like to call her, the grand dame of neurodiversity, whose seminal sociological thesis coined the phrase and unpacked the concept of neurodiversity. And we are nearly 25 years since that thesis was completed. And in that time, the neurodiversity movement has really had, it started slowly and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's now creating quite a big wave in the world of work and quite a big wave in education and community life. And so I thought it would be a great time to catch up with Judy and kind of get her take, really, her hot take on the neurodiversity phenomenon and where it's come to and what she is thinking and seeing these days when she interacts with the ND community and sees what people are up to. So over to you, Judy. So my first question for you is, how do you see the future of neurodiversity?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for that wonderful introduction. That was lovely. And can I say, I'm not really a clairvoyant. I've looked into my crystal ball and it's a bit fuzzy. So could I make that what I would like to see, how I would like to see the neurodiversity movement? And I'm going to put this away because otherwise I'll be reading, because I'm a compulsive reader. So
yes, you absolutely can ask that question, and it's a better question actually. And I think, you know, there's going to be lots of sort of simultaneous threads that come out of neurodiversity. So what kind of thread would you like to see come out of neurodiversity? That's a better question. You're quite right.
Okay, well, given that my idea for neurodiversity was always to add it to intersectionality, and to bring awareness of the complexity of humanity and all its different manifestations. And so what I would like to see is that idea developed further, but at the same time, I'm aware that that intersectionality can be seen as being divisive. And so what I would like to see is a transition from what we're seeing at the moment, which is quite reactive to the hurts of the past that neurodivergent people have experienced. So there's a lot of very, putting ourselves forward, positive thinking, dividing into our little groups. But in what I'd like to see really is unity in diversity as well. So I think the Americans' motto is, you say it,
E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of many we are one. E pluribus unum.
And I think it's now time to bring that together, particularly given the times we're in, because neurodiversity suddenly occurred to me maybe a couple of weeks ago. I don't know whether it was before or Putin started all his attacks, but it occurred to me that neurodiversity is actually Western individualism on steroids. Every single person is different. And so I think we have to start thinking about how we can bring that all together so that it's not divisive. And we also need to think about how much diversity can we realistically handle, or how to organise how we can handle that realistically. So I'd like to see more of that, because we're going to see more and more challenges now. We've got our individualism on steroids. How's it going to go against a culture that's like cultures like Russia and China that are the opposite, collectivists, where the individual is subsumed, and then you have the leaders. Like we're going to have to, I hate to use the word fight, but it's already happening. So
Well,
we
we
need
need to,
to
and
see how
we
we
need to stick
put it
to
together.
we need to get a shared vision, don't we? I feel like there's competing priorities and competing kind of um, takes on this kind of diversity issue. And actually we're all fighting for the same thing and we're all trying to move in the same direction. And I think sometimes it's very easy to get hung up on, so there's a little phrase that I hear a lot, which is, oh, that's problematic, or that person is problematic, or this thing over here that was feminism is problematic because, or this thing over here that was the ADHDers are problematic because. And I hear that voice and I just think to myself, I don't want to call people problematic. I had this really so I do this little thing called a moon lodge with women. So it's just a kind of it's a kind of feminist thing where women come and talk to each other on a dark moon. So on a dark moon we all get together, we drink tea, we eat cake. And one of the young women in my little group, who is a 17-year-old, was saying how problematic earlier generations of feminism were. And myself and my Gen X moms in the room, we were kind of trying to get this young woman to think back to what it must have been like to have been us growing up when feminism was where it was in the 1970s and 80s, and we were explaining to her things like um, the first opening scene of Ghostbusters is Professor Peter Venkman trying to seduce slash harass an 18-year-old student, and kind of how that was considered normal, and all those things were considered normal. And I couldn't get her to see. I couldn't get her. The thing that finally got it was when I pointed out that women in the US weren't allowed credit cards without their husband's permission until the middle of the 1970s. And it was only 4 years later that Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. And I was like, so we can talk about the politics or whether or not we agree with Margaret Thatcher's politics, and we can maybe use the word problematic for those politics. But what we have to agree is that as a woman striving to achieve something that women couldn't achieve in a man's world, that's a pretty big jump for the 1970s. And so it kind of, if I feel like that might be happening in the neurodiversity world as well. We've moved on in so many ways that we're kind of we're forgetting how far we've come. Does
Mm.
that make sense?
Well, yes, it does, and yet the strength of our culture and individualism is free speech, and it is allowing this dialogue or dialectical process of ideas, antagonism coming together. We're still achieving things. I mean, the fact is that we have created feminism, and it is catching on all over the world, and it's not a simple process. And you know, I one of the sorts of psychological movements I was in, which was process-oriented psychotherapy. I mean, one of the things in it was conflict is not resolved until everybody is heard.
Mm,
And I think what we've seen with the neurodiversity movement is that everybody is getting heard. And sometimes for people who it looks self-indulgent and irritating, and even for me, but then I realized that's because I went through this 25 years ago, and we were lucky in that we did it on e-groups, and so we could
mm,
write reams, and now people are reduced to these little blocks on
mm-hmm.
Twitter to share this. So there's that technological aspect, I suppose, but I think it's still the idea is out there and you can't stop it. But and I was just thinking, I haven't heard that word problematic. You British are always ahead of us in
I think it's an American word, you know.
criticism.
Yeah, so and so
Yeah.
is problematic because so and so, so you're thinking about advocates or voices or authors, well, that's problematic because, and it's like, well, yes, I hear that there's problems in there and let's unpack them, but I don't want to dismiss what something brought to a conversation, particularly when I have no frame of reference of what it must have been like to grow up with that particular adversity in your kind of life.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, just retort that life is actually quite problematic.
Problematic. Yes.
Everything humans do is problematic. And one of my favorite images, and if I ever get a logo, it's going to be a double-edged sword. Everything is a double-edged sword in this life. And you need it,
Yeah.
yin and yang. You need these kind of conflicts, even with individualism and collectivism. There is a middle path, which is, if the Buddha said one thing, and I'm not an expert, that's dead right most of the time. And the other thing I wanted to say was that, it's nice being a grand dame, but I'd really like to be a neurodiversity elder because I've lived through all these things, and
Mm.
I've got a lot of wisdom because the things I believed then, I don't necessarily believe anymore. And I've seen intellectual fashions come and go, and the things that we fashion, and I was lucky in that I went through academia in the 60s, then in the late 70s, early 80s, then in the 90s, and the fashions had completely changed, and
Mm.
everything that we were so passionate about had been forgotten. And yeah, just in terms of the feminist thing, my God, when I was growing up, you could only be, that's one of the reasons I ended up in IT because I couldn't do any of the traditional women's jobs and I was terrified. But along came IT and they'd take anybody because it was a growth industry and that was the only place women could earn a decent wage. If you were a teacher, you had to leave if you got married,
Mhm.
um, be a nurse. I'm hopeless at those sorts of things.
Mhm.
So, it's, yeah, it's, yeah, I've got a lot of history. Don't start me.
No, but that's one of the things that I think is lovely about chatting with you is pulling some of that out, and the kind of the feminist neurodivergent intersection is coming up more and more at the moment, isn't it? So,
Mm-hmm.
Rachel Worsley wrote a fantastic piece
Oh,
very recently about autism masking and how she feels as an autist, the thing that she's masking the most is trying to be feminine when she's not naturally feminine. And as an ADHDer, I really relate to that. And what you've just said is a similar thing. So the roles that we do, the things that we want to do, are we approach them in a way that is more typical for men, and then our experience of of kind of sexism really is potentially enhanced because we're not doing things that are typical for women, or not communicating in ways that are typical for women. But
mm.
yeah, I really liked her piece. We'll signpost it in this interview because it was really good. I'm gonna follow her up with that one. But yeah, so I feel like that's
I was
something
just
that's
going to
new.
say feminism's a bit problematic, but I won't go. But yes, it has. I mean, and don't forget, feminism. There was an enormous amount of infighting, and it was called the women's movement then.
Mm,
And there was all kinds, and it was really conflicted, and something has evolved. And there's not one feminism; there's many.
mhm.
And for me, there are aspects of it that I don't like. Aspects of it that I think are really important, but I won't go into all that now.
And is it our job then, when we're part of these movements, either feminist movements or neurodiversity inclusion movements, that our job is to compromise? Our job is to accept that there might be people that we're working with, that we're part of a collective where some of those people are going to have views that we don't agree with, but to be okay with that and to
Mm.
learn to work with people that are not 100% in agreement with us the whole time.
Yeah, and I think also the times do that to us in that we're living in times now that are beginning to concentrate our minds wonderfully, I think.
Yeah.
It's not something I would wish on anyone, but there are big challenges ahead, and I just have to keep getting back to the thing of the times will force us to unify, probably, if I'm a big
Mm.
person. So unity and diversity is where we've got to head. Now, how we do that is an evolving process like everything else.
And do we need to learn to accept the conflict and to just live with it? and to not have it be a massive drama, but to just be like, there will be conflict, to be pragmatic and more kind of stoic about the different conflicts and more forgiving of each other.
Oh, absolutely. But wait till I get on Twitter and I see certain people who I've blocked, and I go and look at them anyway and get myself incredibly riled up, like
Hmm.
a human.
Hmm.
And um, what can you do? We just have to be aware. Like I think you wrote something about awareness is not the answer, but I wasn't sure. I haven't read it, so I don't know what you meant.
I did a
Hmm.
webinar on it. Yeah. That came from some research that I've been doing with Almut at the Centre for Neurodiversity Research at Work. So Almut and I and our one of our PhD students did a systematic review of systematic reviews, which gets a little bit navel gazy, let's be honest. But what we were pulling out was so we searched for a whole, what we wanted to know is what works. So if you're going to do an inclusion activity in an organization, what is actually going to make a difference, and how are we judging difference? So are we saying that, increased representation, that's an outcome, that's what we want to know, what does that? Are we saying what creates learning outcomes, um, what creates performance or productivity outcomes? So what are the things that make a difference? And instead, because neurodiversity research at work is quite new and there isn't very much of it, there's a tendency to reinvent the wheel. And so what we're observing is that neurodiversity initiatives look like gender equality or race equality initiatives looked like 15, 20 years ago, but they're much older and they have better research and better evidence. So we pulled through the systematic reviews from race, from disability generally, from gender, from LGBTQIA papers, and we went, what are the principles underlying the programs that have been shown to be effective? And we found a really mixed bag for awareness training. So awareness training can be effective. It can be effective at changing minds, but it doesn't tend to change behavior. So the same behavior, so people will report feeling differently and thinking differently, but it won't necessarily increase inclusion. It doesn't, more people don't come into that business that weren't there before, as the result of awareness training. But there are
I
things
have,
you can.
I'm not quite sure what awareness training is, but I can remember when I was on an interview panel once in the public service, and we had very strict
Mm,
guidelines on, we didn't call it intersectionality, but, ethnicity and all that sort of stuff. And all the other interviewers, they were following it to the letter, but they were just, and then at the end, they they were talking about, like, I think there was a lot of Indian people that we were interviewing, and they were just sharing all the stereotypes without any
yeah.
of awareness.
Yeah. So they went through
Straight.
the process and then in the
Mm,
end they just kind of went back to default.
mm,
Mm.
that's
Yeah. So the things that work are making managers accountable for diversity. So it has to be something that managers have to do. And if you want awareness training to make a difference, and this isn't going to feel nice, this doesn't feel fun to me, but you have to make the training mandatory. So it has to be that everybody has to go on it, and so do the leaders in a business. So you can't just send your staff on awareness training and not turn up yourself. You have to go on it yourself, and it has to be something that everybody does, and it has to be mandatory. And then what that's doing is sending an implicit signal to the staff that this is really important, and then they change their behavior. So you have to build things like that in at the policy level, for an organization. But the other thing that we got out of that research, which we're writing up at the moment, which was really, really interesting, what for me anyway, this was the thing that I hadn't worked out, that I was kind of quite surprised by, is that there's not a huge number of studies that have looked at work performance and productivity as a result of diversity, but the ones that have found the same thing consistently, which is when you increase the diversity, in the short term, you increase conflict and then you get lower productivity. But in the medium to long term, that's when you get higher productivity and higher creativity and yeah, so higher output, higher sales, whatever you're measuring, but also higher engagement and reporting of well-being and liking the place that they work and feeling good about their job. So that comes, but it comes in the medium to long term, not in the short term. So initially there's that conflict, and that's kind of what you were saying earlier, which is that, as diverse people come together, there is conflict, and it's a natural part of the process. And so while we might engage in it and find ourselves on Twitter being grumpy about different things, it is just part of the process.
Well, I don't know. I think I will give this a critical once over as well, because what you're suggesting sounds very coercive to me. So it's more of a collectivist thing. And we have thrived on, in terms of productivity and speed and efficiency, in the old way, and in terms of free speech and all the rest of it. So that's a very genuine concern of, I don't know if you've read that book, it's my Bible now, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, which
I think,
talks
yeah, no,
about all of this.
yeah.
You really need to read it. It's incredible. You'd like it because it's incredibly thoroughly researched, too thoroughly for my lay understanding. But basically, it talks about this stuff all the time, that um, it's all about balance. And
Mm,
what you're saying sounds very coercive to me, and people will be resentful.
mhm,
And I'm interested in the fact that the neurodiversity movement, as a leaderless discourse, really, people talking about it. I've said this many times, that it's not a movement, it's a conversation.
mm,
It's a movement in the sense of a discourse or a conversation, where if you're taking part in that conversation, whether you're for it or against it, that conversation is growing, and that movement or discourse is growing. And we've achieved an enormous amount with that, just just by doing that. And now,
mm,
for instance, I'm very concerned about uh, big business kind of sailing in over the top of everything that's been achieved and trying to take control of it, often by people who don't really understand it but see it as a competitive advantage, which is
mhm,
quite naive. It may well be. It's a human advantage, in my opinion,
mm.
to include more people, to find more roles for people. Um, and I think I may have lost my thread here. So, yes, and then we talk about, the neurodiversity industry, that it needs more regulation because there's
Mhm,
so many possible cowboys. We just don't know.
mm.
Um,
Yeah.
so, and once like everything is a double-edged sword. And it just occurred to me beforehand that, in terms of, it's always patronizing for the dominant culture to say, or the progressive elements of it to say, well, we've got to change,
Mm,
but so can everybody change. And that's also finding the middle path. So, for instance, I don't know, autistic people can learn or take it upon themselves to learn, look, manners, like common manners, to how to grease the wheels of society. That's almost a responsibility. People with ADHD need to learn to stop talking sometimes and just, keep it compact. People need to learn to, listen to each other. Like, we can
mhm.
all change a little, and we're going to need to get along.
Yeah, it's that fine balance, isn't it, between what is kind of just a completely acceptable um, expectation that you build rapport with people who are different to you by kind of accommodating some of their patterns and changing in response to them, and then what's masking and what's kind of an unacceptable level of having to be something or someone that you're not on a daily basis in order to survive and thrive. So that, and that, I find that the window of that balance really difficult, because I think we're never going to have a policy or a process for that. It's not, it's a very nuanced thing. and it depends incredibly on the individual and their context, and the same individual in different contexts might have different expectations. Something and I find that interesting at Genius Within as well, because so many of us are ND. So
Mm.
in a kind of standard company, if you've got like, a few people that are ND, well, actually the neurotypical majority can kind of make exceptions for that person who goes into a shutdown mode, or who speaks very directly, or who talks with their hands all the time and freaks everybody out. Whoever that they can accommodate that. But when you've got a majority ND team, and you've got the ADHDers talking loudly and moving their hands around all the time, and you've got a different ND kind of going into a bit of a withdrawal and an overwhelm moment. How do you decide whose pattern is most important? Who needs to shift? Who needs to be the one that takes responsibility for accommodating that different communication style? That's a really, really interesting question for me.
Yeah, the question of masking, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
like this masking, um, again, my experience of, I don't have the experience you have where you see hundreds of neurodivergent people in your work all the time. I know myself, my family. I know, I founded or co-founded rather, Sydney's biggest independent social club that wasn't for Asperger's teenagers. Our idea was to have fun. I saw a lot of Asperger's teenagers in that. I saw a few people who I didn't think were Asperger's, but they'd been diagnosed that way. It's not like the medical profession, they were just newbies.
Mm,
And so they identified with us, and that was great, um, we were an intentional community, and everybody found an identity there. Um, the kids who were asocial um, felt that they belonged to a group in which they could be asocial.
mm-hmm.
Ones that probably weren't Asperger's actually bound everybody together and created a bit, like it was actually a thriving
Mm-hmm.
little microcosm. And that's what I know about that. I don't know. I know that I find some autistic people really annoying. I find some ADHD people really annoying.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Interestingly, because I'm hyperlexic, if you need to label something, and it's not something I'm anxious about, so I've never cared about whether people can spell or not. It's like when you're good at something, you're just grateful,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't feel the need. It's only the people who are anxious about their own,
Mm-hmm.
say, reading, that they try to monitor everyone else. So anyway, so masking. So where we all get socialized, and I use this example all the time. Here I am using my hand.
Mm-hmm.
The
You're gonna get
screen.
no argument from me about hand waving. You go right ahead. Wave all you need.
So yeah. So what was I saying? Um, so where does masking
Where does
or
masking
socialized
end and just
or the other
normal
way
social
around?
reciprocity start?
Yeah, because I was saying, this is my usual example, that no one was born with an innate desire to work 9 to 5 for the rest of their lives for 2 weeks holiday, not enough pay for someone else's profit. No, we were socialized into that, and we're all masking, because if we had what we wanted to do, it would be a very different world. So we all mask. Um, and then in other terms of masking, for instance, I've got friends who, I don't know, I wouldn't diagnose them, but they're people who just blurt things out without thinking,
No
and
filter. Mm.
and drive people around them mad, because so, and I'm thinking, look, for myself, I've been on antidepressants for, I don't know, 30 years maybe. Um, I didn't want to be, but one of the reasons and this is an interesting question as well, one of the reasons I did it was, the final straw was a really good friend of mine who I didn't want to lose said, we can't be friends anymore because you're always crying. I can't stand it anymore. And so I did it to conform to more to social expectations. And I have friends, and I just wish they would bloody well take something, and stop having every all. So now that we've got these drugs that have been developed in our complex society,
Mhm.
maybe we need to take it as a responsibility to. I mean, this is controversial.
It is. Yeah.
I understand that, but I've done
Yeah.
it. So I have had people who have just used my energy time and time again with their anxieties, and I, spend hours
Mhm.
talking them down. And I say to them, have you thought about taking anti-anxiety drugs? Because
Mhm.
if it
Mhm.
is innate, it's not a moral thing. I mean, if you have diabetes, I don't have diabetes, but if you have diabetes and you don't make enough
Yeah.
whatever chemicals, you take them. And if you don't make enough whatever it is that makes you happy because you're born that way, well,
And
maybe you should
you
not,
could
burden
say
your friends beyond a certain level.
the same thing about diabetic medicine being a social construction. Do you know, like we live in a world where we don't have access to fresh food, where we don't have access to local food, where we eat a lot of over packaged food, and we're hyper sold corn syrup and sugar in basic, everyday cereals. So, is
Yeah.
there it so therefore taking diabetes medication is kind of um a response to a social construction. So if and that's similar to the whole kind of I don't need meds because I'm not broken and I don't need fixing kind of thing. And I mean, I have a personal
Yeah.
take on this, which was when I
That's why
first
it's
started.
controversial. It is
Yeah,
controversial.
it is controversial because a lot of what we're saying in neurodiversity is, the reason that we're struggling is because we're living in a world that isn't created for us. And we've got this kind of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and we've got this kind of hypersensory overload, and we've got all these things. Um, are you still there? Yeah, you are still there. And so, and so
I'm
therefore, yeah, why would I need to be medicated? I've been traumatized by my environment. But the reality is we're still traumatized by our environment. And when I was finishing my PhD was the first time I medicated for ADHD, and the I was seeing a clinical psychologist at the time because I was very close to having a proper little breakdown. And the clinical psychologist, I'd done that thing where I'd caught myself thinking something ridiculous like, my goodness, I'm such a pain in the neck, I expect my family would be better off without me. And I went, oh yes, that thought. Yes, when we have those thoughts, we go and see people about that. We go and see them straight away. We do not pass go. We go and find ourselves a very good clinical psychologist, and we get into it. And one of the first things she said to me is, why are you not medicating for ADHD? And I said, well, because when I was living in Vermont and I had big blue skies and bright light every day, and I could go running or skiing and I could just be out and in my body and doing things, I didn't feel bad, and I don't see why I should. She said, let me just stop you there. You're not living in Vermont, you're living in Sussex. It's winter, it's a grey sky, and you have to sit down for 15 hours a day and write. Why are you giving yourself such a hard time? And I was just like, oh, yeah, got a point there. Got a point there, Dr. Byron. So yeah, so yes, and yeah, took ADHD meds, felt great, finished
Took
my
me a long
PhD.
time. But first of all, I had to be assured that we had good meds so that,
Yeah.
I read listening to Prozac, that really helped to change my mind. But there's a story that because basically we have evolved here,
Mm,
and we all have trauma. We have so much history. You know how much historical trauma I carry from the Holocaust and everything else. I might even have epigenetics from my mother's experiences in a concentration camp. And maybe I was born that way, and I've suffered long enough. And it really, really changed my mind. It freed up my energy to actually do something.
mhm, mhm,
So there's that. And then I just had this idea while you were talking. You know how we should be waging war now?
mhm.
We should bomb Putin's water supply with oxytocin. That's what we should do.
Well,
That
you know,
man,
there's a theory that he's on that he's on steroids because he's ill. Have you seen that?
yeah,
So
I've thought that.
he's
Isn't
just
that
jacked up
interesting?
on steroids that make you angry and grumpy with everybody.
I'm thinking that, but also there is the thing about dictators. It's kind of like when you get too much power, absolute power corrupt. There's actually, you
Mhm.
probably know this, there's a
Mhm.
neurological reason for that, and you actually lose empathy. So
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
could be. So we bomb them with oxytocin, and why not? And then I thought of another sort of story, and I don't know where I read it, maybe in process-oriented psychotherapy or somewhere. And it was about this kingdom which had a very wise and just king, and somehow or other the water supply got polluted, and everyone drew water from the well, and it poisoned them, and they all threw off their clothes and ran mad off, went amuck into the forest. So what did the king do? He drank from the water and threw his clothes off and ran off after them. And to me, that's
Mhm.
a good story.
Joke, if you can't beat them, join them. I mean, I think the thing for me with that whole med shaming and meds, versus you're not broken, you don't need fixing debate. Again, you can't come down on either side of that because the individuals are in their different contexts. But the other thing for me that I really realized when I was having that conversation with my psychologist was it's privilege. It's about privilege. Do you know so I've been privileged to create environments for me in which I don't feel the need to medicate. But if I was living in a life, let's say I was living in a small apartment with raising kids on my own and trying to hold down a job and trying to remember those kids homework. Let's say I've got three of them, different ages, different homeworks, world book day, different things, that then ADHD, I couldn't cope with that. I know I couldn't cope with that. I had two children. They were the same age. They needed the same thing at the same time, and I was barely hanging on there. But if there had been things in my life that were not, I was privileged because I had a husband who was actually an actual parent who was doing those things with me, and so and he doesn't have ADHD, which is very helpful. But if that wasn't the case, then those meds would have been the difference between my kids thriving in school or just about barely hanging on, and it would have been the difference between me just about hanging on to my job and not hanging on to my job. So I think yeah, I'm just wary of people judging anybody, really wary of judgmentalism.
But hang on. So in my case, I have every single disadvantage: sole parent, tiny public housing, badly maintained, autistic daughter, autistic mother, dysfunctional family, the Holocaust, a refugee,
Hmm.
everything. Precarious employment, and I didn't want to take drugs. I went through all that barely hanging on, and yet I
Hmm.
had to, my daughter, but I suffered so much. And you forget that, I don't know about England, you've got national health. You can get it's
Yeah.
not hard to get a prescription.
No, it's
So,
not. No. But
I
it's but
mean,
it's but it's privilege if you don't need it. Do you know what I mean? So I think when we advocate to
oh,
people
I
that they
see
shouldn't,
when you don't
yeah,
need
if
it.
we're saying to people you shouldn't take this because it's you need to just be in your environment, you need to have better strategies, you need to do 15 minutes of mindfulness in the morning before you start processing the world. All of that stuff is just like, really, do I
Oh,
actually?
you know what
Okay.
I've always said? I've been to 40 years of, at least, of every kind of therapy. I have not changed one iota. The only thing that's changed,
Yeah.
the only thing that's really made a difference to my life was Zoloft. But even that's not the answer. Then I developed restless leg syndrome, and now I take Parkinson drugs, which make me madly impulsive, and it
Mhm.
just goes
Mhm.
on. And life has got all that suffering. But I get, yeah, definitely get your point. Just,
Mhm.
don't get on your high horse
Mhm.
and tell people
Yeah,
not
and I
to
think this is a
take
a nice
medication.
point. This is a nice point for the last question then, really, because I think we've meandered around the other questions. So let's kind of bring it back. The last question was around the Professor Pangloss and the Pollyanna perspectives. And I think what we've just been talking about is not that. So do you want to just explain who Professor Pangloss and who Pollyanna are? Because I think you've got a great take on this.
Well, I've always heard about Voltaire's 18th century book, Candide, and I never read it. And I read it recently, and I just thought, and it's about the same time that I was looking at Pollyanna and thinking, why do we always sheet the blame home to women? And Dr. Pangloss is what it's about. It's about basically, it means you put a happy gloss over no matter what happened. And Candide is about this innocent who totally is a follower of Pangloss, and life just dishes out one unspeakable horror after the other, and he's always going, everything, all for the best in the best of possible worlds is the same, and this goes on till the end, and then at the very end, when they're maimed, blind, whatever, they come home and do their, and Dr. Pangloss finally says, you know what, just tend to your garden. And so at least he gets some insight at the end. But I like the idea of Pangloss because it's Pollyanna, large and lit and written dark. And so to me, Pangloss, Pollyanna are kind of polygloss. How about polygloss?
Yeah, so it's the same thing, but without the gender.
Polygloss.
So there's, polygloss. Yeah.
No, polygloss. Okay, polygloss is a new thing.
So we've got some polygloss perspectives in the neurodiversity world. How far are we going to be able to take this, do you think?
Well, I think we sort of already covered it when we said, it's first of all that it's a reaction to the oppression and that we went through, and that in my era we did it on e-groups, and so it was kind of private, and we just had it all out, and then eventually, found support groups, found whatever, and probably moved on. And so I think this is just the reaction phase to what went before. And the times are actually going to force us back to what we were talking more about, not assimilation, but integration.
That's it. Yes.
That's the word.
Yes.
That's really interesting because I'm a great believer in serendipity. I don't care what you say. I don't believe in anything transcendental except serendipity, which is everywhere. And yesterday I heard this. Went to a talk by this Argentinian rabbi who's one of the world leaders of the global green movement. He was also a parliamentarian in Argentina, and that was what came. I wasn't even going to go, but what came out of it was he said, we're seeking as Jews, but as minorities, in other words. And don't forget that everything I know about minorities comes out of me being in that minority that suffered so much racism for the last couple of thousand years. And he was saying what we need to do is integration, not assimilation. We don't want to become like you. We've always resisted becoming like you, but we can get along with you. So maybe that's a good place to end.
I think that's a great place to end for the whole neurodiversity movement, actually. So even the differences between us, as well as the differences within us, as a movement and as a phenomenon, that we integrate, not assimilate.
And as you say, there's a couple of, I know this is tedious, but I don't care. It's basically it comes down to the same old truisms. The serenity prayer, accept the things you can change, which is your genes. Have the courage to change the things you can, which is your beliefs or environment. And learn from, and find a teacher, find a friend, keep learning. And what was the other one? Yeah,
Well,
your thing, you
the one
say,
the one I
the,
always like is the
the
quote from
Talmud,
the
yeah.
Talmud. Yeah, do not be
Is
daunted
that
by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it.
the idea is not to assimilate or try to force others to assimilate, but be ready to integrate for the greater good of humanity because we have so many challenges that we're facing.
Thank you, Judy. As always, it's great to chat to you.
It was wonderful to chat to you, always.